Welcome everyone to the Green New Deal podcast, and welcome to 2023. I'm your host, Alex King, and I'm joined today by environmentalist extraordinaire Adam Williams. How are you, Ads?
I'm very well, mate. Welcome to the new year, everyone. Buzzing. Last year was amazing. We've got big plans for this year. Alex, what are you looking forward to for this year, mate?
I am looking forward to some of the more live shows that we hopefully will be doing, written content, videos, and hopefully putting out great climate content for the whole year. How about yourself?
Well, obviously, we did a live event at the back end of last year, Working Class Voices live event, and I would love to go into our communities now and maybe create some workshops with my comrades, Niall Glynn and Zara Manahotu, and around concepts such as economics, climate consciousness, and community resilience. So if anybody out there wants to hire out a community centre or a local cafe and get in touch and get us down talking, that would be peak for me this year.
And that's anywhere in Greater Manchester.
Anywhere in Greater Manchester. Listen, we'll go anywhere, but I'm really hoping to get into those traditional working class areas, North Manchester, East Manchester, places that kind of get forgotten when it comes to climate change. But as everybody knows, I believe without the working class fully on board, we're going nowhere. So I really want to try and get into those neighbourhoods to try and set off a few sparks there.
So corporations and governments love to tell us about their commitments to curbing emissions. More than 70 countries, including the biggest polluters, have all set up a net zero target covering about 76% of global emissions. While even the likes of ExxonMobil emblazon their websites and adverts with net zero pledges. And yet, global emissions in 2021 were 60% higher than they were in 1990, and they're still climbing. How is this possible? What kinds of odious sleights of hand, legal niceties, or accountancy scams are going on here? Where are we now, really, when it comes to emissions? How long do we have left to turn things around? And what role should scientists play in getting us to act on their findings as the crisis deepens? Helping us examine the uses and abuses of climate science, we are delighted to welcome back Professor Kevin Anderson. Kevin is a Professor of Energy and Climate Change at the University of Manchester and is also a former Director of the Tyndall Centre of Climate Research. Welcome back, Kevin.
Hello, it's nice to be back with you.
First question I had for you, Kevin, just before we dive into net zero, which I know you've been talking about a lot recently, I just wanted to start from the beginning and give listeners a refresh on what we're trying to achieve here. Climate science literature and policies are full of references to 1 degrees Celsius of warming. Could you briefly explain the significance of that number, please?
Yeah. Well, there's two temperatures we often hear about in relation to climate change, 1.5 degrees centigrade and 2 degrees centigrade, which when it's -5 where I'm living at the moment, I think you think, well, I quite like a couple of degrees warmer. But these are global average temperature rises that are going to occur if we don't rapidly cut our carbon dioxide emissions. And that principally means cut our fossil fuel use. And there are huge changes in the climate. In modern human time, we've only ever really seen at the most about 1 degree centigrade of warming, over the last 10,000 years now. So what's happening at the moment in just, really 50 to 100 years, we've seen a rise of about 1 degree. So compared with when we started to burn fossil fuels in the 1850s, we're almost 1.2 degrees higher temperature now. And as I say, that's a global average. Most of the planet is covered in water, which takes longer to warm up. So that means the average temperature on land has gone up significantly more. I work in Sweden quite a lot, and we've had there, the rise has been almost 2 degrees centigrade now. But then we have to remember also that geographically around the world, there are big differences. So 1.5 to 2 degrees centigrade of warming is about 6 degrees in the poles, which is why we're really very concerned about the rate of melt of ice, particularly on Greenland, in Antarctica, and of course in the Arctic. And these temperatures mean that we're putting a lot more energy into the atmosphere. So there's a lot more energy that can change weather patterns. It can move monsoons. It can give you more droughts, more floods, more severe typhoons and hurricanes, which can affect agriculture, affect our infrastructure. And so although we often think about it, it's just extreme weather. This extreme weather has huge impacts on how we live our lives, but also on the rest of the world's ecosystems. And they're not separate to us. They're not just something you watch in a David Attenborough program. They're actually the things that allow us to live on this planet. They clean the air for us. They pollinate our crops for us. And so these changes in temperature are absolutely huge, occurring very rapidly. Both human systems and ecological systems can't deal with this rapid rate of change.
Where does the number come from, and what is 2 degrees as opposed to 1.5?
Let's be really clear about this. Science can't tell you what is or is not dangerous. That's a decision that we make as humans through politics, through our engagement with other people. Science can inform that decision. It can tell us what the impacts might look like and things like that, but it can't tell us whether we consider it dangerous or not. And so we have these big international negotiations, like we had one recently in Egypt and previously last year in Glasgow. And at these negotiations, world governments come together and they decide what is or is not reasonable. And back in Paris, there was a really big negotiation with world leaders. And the agreement there was that we would cut our emissions. So we would keep emissions keep temperature rises well below 2 degrees centigrade. But the poorer parts of the world, who are at the forefront of the impacts of climate change, impacts that we've caused by our use of fossil fuels, but these poorer communities around the world, they pushed very hard to have say that we should also aim for really just 1.5 degrees centigrade of warming. And one of the reasons that difference is so important, I mean, there's only half a degree between 1.5 and 2 degrees, but the impacts of 1.5 are very severe. But the impacts of 2 degrees centigrade are still more devastating. And they're fully aware of that. I mean, they're going to lose some of their communities. Some of the small island states will no longer exist. It will destroy a lot of the crops around the coastal zones. So there's huge differences in impacts between 1.5 and 2 degrees, which is why those poorer parts of the world pushed very hard. But let's not pretend that's safe. Even that level of warming will continue to kill people around the world through all sorts of weather patterns, through changes in agriculture, through increased tension. So if you've got places where there's some military tension and then you've got droughts or floods or other issues like that, they just exacerbate other existing tensions. 1.5 is not a safe threshold, but is now the absolute best that we could achieve.
People often talk about carbon budgets to meet 1.5. How big is our carbon budget?
The carbon budget is what that basically means is how much carbon dioxide can we dump in the atmosphere before we get to 1.5 degrees centigrade of warming? And we have so if you put a certain amount in the atmosphere, then you've got 1.5, you put in more, you might get 2, and you put more carbon dioxide, you might get 3. The other greenhouse gases are also important, but carbon dioxide, mostly from burning fossil fuels, is the key one. If we want to stay below 1.5, and if we want sort of a 50-50 chance, so not a great chance of staying below 1.5 degrees centigrade of warming, but a 50-50 chance, then we can put in the atmosphere, this number doesn't mean much to many people, about 380 billion tons of carbon dioxide. To put that in some sort of perspective, we currently emit about 40 odd billion tons, so it's under 10 years of current emissions. If we carried on like this for the next 10 years, in fact, just really about the next 9 years now, we would have put so much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, we would be locking in 1.5 degrees centigrade of warming. That shows how rapidly we've got to reduce our emissions. So if we carried on like this, then by 2020, and the end of 2032, we'd have to stop all fossil fuel use around the globe immediately. But of course, what we need to do is start to bring the emissions down now, and then that gives us a little bit longer. But there's one other really important part that we sign up to every single year in every international negotiation, going right the way back to 1992 and the big Real Earth Summit that some of your listeners might remember, and that is that fairness is a really key part of this. In this sort of concept of fairness and equity that's embedded in all the agreements, the poorer countries have longer to move away from fossil fuels than the richer countries. So the richer countries have got to lead. Now that means for 1.5 degrees centigrade, the UK and other wealthy countries need to be zero emissions sometime between 2030 and 2035. Now that is incredibly tight, 2030 to 2035. So we have to start bringing our emissions down right now, not opening new coal mines, not licensing more oil and gas, but actually bringing our emissions down so we're at zero between 2030 and 2035. Now, to a lot of your listeners, that will sound impossible. It sounds impossible because, to be put it bluntly, we've lied and we've covered things up on climate change for the last 30 years. We had all this information at our fingertips back in the 1990s, and we've just given, it's just been rhetoric and sort of PR. That's all we've really seen on climate change significantly since then. And as you said at the beginning, our emissions have just continued globally to rise. And even in countries like the UK, they've hardly come down at all when you look at our full carbon footprint.
Kevin, you've touched on a number of issues here that I think they're so tricky for the general public. The first one is, the idea that the Earth is warming up. We're sat here now, it's probably about -2 degrees in Manchester. For most people, the idea that it's going to warm up just a little bit, like when you say it's going to go from, small amounts, it almost feels like, oh yeah, I can deal with a bit of that. Yeah, that's the first thing. The second thing is, when you're talking in points of decimals, like 1.5 and 1.4, again, for the mainstream people, it doesn't sound like a massive change. But also as well, there's a belief in the political system currently, that we've got an incompetent system, incompetent government that aren't going to ever really put in the work that's needed. And I'm wondering if you could perhaps refocus people's minds on how they should be thinking about these things, not necessarily like it's going to warm up or worrying too much about 1.2 to 1.4 to 1.5, but more about what is the reality of these. I know you've touched on it slightly, but what can people focus on to say, right, this means that, and if you focus on that, that is what is important. Don't worry about these incremental, tiny sort of scientific measures. What can people on the street, what do you want them to focus on to really understand and believe the crisis that we're in?
If we think about it locally, and let's be clear, most of the impacts, at least initially, are felt in certain parts of the world that are not the UK. I mean, if you live in Northern Europe, then you're much more insulated from the early impacts of climate change, but not completely. I mean, we've had some sort of very unusual weather patterns in the UK. We see the change in seasons in the UK, and that, we think, well, okay, does it matter if it's a change in seasons? But that can significantly affect things like agriculture, which means it affects food prices. Well, given you've got a massive increase in energy prices and you increase food prices, that means people in the UK who are already struggling, many households in the UK are already struggling. We have that expression, heating or eating. Well, the way we're going at the moment, the food is going up in price and the energy is going up in price. So they're going to really struggle to do both of those, and even one of them will be quite difficult. So these are real world repercussions we see played out even just in the UK. But beyond that, of course, what we see globally are these sort of tensions occurring, which can lead into things like mass migration. So we've seen the problems that some of the tensions in certain parts of the world have brought about in terms of mass migration. Now, as someone who actually I think we should be welcoming migrants to the UK. Nevertheless, I think for most migrants, they'd rather stay at home. They'd rather not have to find somewhere else to get a decent living. And climate change is going to force many people, many millions, if not tens and possibly even hundreds of millions of people, to relocate. And of course, where will they want to go to? They want to go to places that are safer, both politically, but also climatically. And so if we want to curtail the sort of levels of migration and all the trauma and terrors that these people have to go through to get to Northern Europe, if we want to try and stop that, then we need to be severely cutting our emissions, because they are really at the front line of our impacts, and they're suffering them today. It's not as if this is a problem for tomorrow. They are suffering those impacts as we speak today. People are suffering from climate change and dying from climate change around the world today, and in large numbers. So there are impacts at home for us, but there are impacts, of course, globally, which then play out for us. We're all in a global world today. One of the reasons that our energy prices are really high, and that lots of people, many of them who are listening to your program, will be sat in cold houses today because they can't afford the heating. Well, one of the reasons we cannot afford the heating is because our leaders, in all their wonderful wisdom, decided not to develop lots of renewable energy for the UK, which would have meant we were much more insulated from the world oil and gas prices. They chose not to do that, but instead to continue to lock us in to ever more fossil fuel use. So the reason a lot of households in the UK today are struggling to afford their heating is thanks to incompetent politicians over the last 10, 20 and 30 years. So if we had responded to the climate agenda, actually we would have had a lot more indigenous, home-produced, renewable energy today, which would have been completely insulated from whatever Putin chooses to do. And it's Putin's war, I see it, not Russia's war, it's Putin's war. But all of that's destabilized energy prices around the world and means that a lot of people are suffering, even in what is around about the sixth wealthiest country in the world. We have probably 7 to 10 million households that are really struggling at the moment with energy prices and indeed with food prices. That is down to Putin, but it's also down to our incompetent politicians. And whilst I'm quite honest about this, whilst I'm a member of the Labour Party, they are included in those incompetent politicians over the last 20 or so years.
And that's not even touching on retrofitting, and that's obviously a big part that could have been kicking in.
We could have been doing this. We have terrible housing stock in the UK. It's one of the worst sort of levels of housing stock across Europe, and particularly when we're a relatively northern European country with quite a cold climate, and yet we've got these houses that are in really appalling conditions. I always sort of joke that a Swedish tent is about as efficient as a British house. It is, in some respects, we laugh about it, but we have to think, well, people are living inside these houses. In the 6th richest country in the world, recently that coroner showed that demonstrated that child had died from mold in a housing association property.
Yep, here in Greater Manchester.
In one of the richest countries in the world, we have people who are living with fungal spores in their houses that are causing bronchial problems for their children. And in fact, children are dying as a consequence of this. We have air pollution on our streets, where we know that children are dying from that air pollution. And it's how come it's affecting their prospects at school, their educational prospects. So, across the board, a very rich country like the UK has locked itself into fossil fuels, which has meant that people really struggle in their own houses in cold weather, particularly. But also, of course, the air quality is very poor in a lot of our cities. Why are we in this situation? We're in this situation through poor leadership.
Speaking of incompetent politicians, you say that for a reasonable chance to stay at 1.5, we need zero emissions from fossil fuels by around 2030, 2031.
Yeah, it depends exactly how you split out this carbon budget between every country. But I would say somewhere between 2030 and 2035, we need to be zero emissions from fossil fuels. In other words, no more fossil fuel use. Planes, trains, ships, cars, heating, everything.
And yet the government has pledged to be net zero by 2050. So what's going on there? Why is there such a big gap?
There's a number of bits to that, and I'll try and keep it reasonably straightforward. We know from the science how much carbon dioxide we can dump in the atmosphere. That's our carbon budget. The science doesn't tell us how we split that up. And in typical colonial fashion, the way that countries like the UK see that, well, we're the UK. We should get a larger slice of the pie than is really fair. It's a typical British approach to these things. And so we assume here that we'll have a bigger chunk. And of course, who will have to forgo their size of the pie? It'll be the poorer countries again. So the UK government, and in fact, I would argue its advisors, are relying on this old colonial story of the Brits should have slightly more than is really fair. In fact, quite a lot more than is really fair. So that's one of the reasons that allows us to rely on a much later date. It's also really important, this word net zero. Ask some of your listeners from 5 years ago, and they won't have ever heard of net zero then, because we didn't use that expression. It's a new expression that is used everywhere. Most people don't even know what it means.
Yeah.
And what it really means, you just change the E in the middle and put an O, and you'd have not zero. And that's a more accurate account of it. Yeah. The government is not intending to be zero fossil fuel use in 2050. It's still, in fact, the government's own spreadsheets that underpin their policy still show over 30 million tons of carbon dioxide dumped in the atmosphere from burning fossil fuels in 2050, and they call that net zero. So we're still carrying on burning fossil fuels in 2050, and we're not stopping then. It would be reasonable to think the government's thinking about stopping fossil fuels probably sometime around about 2075. But do they really care? I don't think so, because none of those will be alive then. So what they've done is put these dates well outside their term of office, far in the future, which means for them, they don't have to put in policies that are more challenging to develop today. So they can just carry on with business as usual, pass the buck on to the next set of policymakers who will pass it on to the next set of policymakers who will pass it on to our children. And that's what we've been doing since 1990. Not just the UK, pretty much every wealthy country has done this. Since 1990 on to today. Okay, we've got some more wind turbines and we've got a few solar panels now, but we've also got lots and lots of fossil fuel use. We're expanding our airports. We're building more roads. So we're building houses that still require a lot of heating, when in fact we can build houses that require no heating. So there are lots of things we can be doing. We have the technical skills already, but we choose not to do them. And that's why with this net zero 2050, it just allows that business as usual to carry on.
Kevin, if you could just give a brief overview of what the theory is around net zero for people in the audience that are not sure of the term.
Yeah. I wish we really had a very clear definition of net to zero. It's used by everyone. And I think when you ask people, most people, well, that's what everyone else says. They don't really think what it means. So the idea behind it, and there is some scientific legitimacy behind the idea, in a sort of purely theoretical sense, is that if we pump lots of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, that's okay, provided we find some other way to remove the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So whether that's big sort of Dr. Strangelove machines in the years to come that will suck the CO2 out of the air, whether it's planting more trees or something like that. I mean, it won't be us planting more trees. It's usually we pay another country in the poor part of the world to plant trees. So there's some ways then to say remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And that allows us to carry on expanding our airports and so forth. And that's where this word net comes in. So the net impact is zero. So we dump 10 million tons of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, but we find some way to, our children find some way to suck 10 million tons of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, and we can call that net zero.
Yeah.
But it's really dangerous, that, because we know when we fly a plane today, when we drive a car today, then we know that we're putting carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. That's an absolute guarantee. There's no guarantee that these technologies will work at the scale that is assumed. There's no guarantee if you plant lots of trees that they will lock in carbon dioxide for the long term. Yeah. They probably won't.
And it's always sort of a bullshit rough estimate as well, isn't it? Like a corporation will buy a plot of land, plant loads of trees, but there's no actual mathematical calculation that the carbon dioxide that they're producing will be sucked down by these trees. It's just sort of like a tick box, isn't it? So we've planted some trees over there, and that allows us to do what we want over here, and we'll call that net zero.
Yeah, and exactly that. And they'll no doubt find a co-opted academic or consultancy will give them some sort of dodgy spreadsheet to make out that actually is the same thing. So we all have to be very careful with these expressions. I really don't like net zero. I think it's been incredibly dangerous. And just think who has signed up to net zero. BP, Shell, Chevron, Saudi Aramco, basically every oil company signs up to net zero by 2050. Look at the countries that have signed up to net zero. The UK, Russia, Norway, the US, basically every country that produces oil and gas at the moment and is currently looking for more oil and gas has also signed up to net zero. At the moment, it is a complete political scam. And my concern, actually, is that those of us who work on climate change should be pointing this out every day. Every time these people use net zero, we should point out how they are using it as a scam, but we don't. And so we've lent legitimacy to that expression, because everywhere you go now, this language of net zero is just used without people stopping and thinking, what does it really mean? And what it really means is that we can pass the burden on to future generations, and we don't have to put in place these really strict policies that we'd have to do today if we were to respond to the climate agenda.
Yeah, but I suppose another thing that happens that I feel like I've observed is people kind of kidding themselves that we've actually made really good progress over the last 30 years, and that because we've made good progress, we're doing enough and we're heading in the right direction. So, like, some of our UK-based listeners might say, well, we're always hearing from the government that our carbon emissions are 50% lower today than they were in 1990. So what's going on there? What kind of accountancy scams are going on there?
Yeah, it's not just the government to say that, unfortunately. You hear again, I hear academics trotting out government statistics, or the government's Committee on Climate Change, who we have to remember was set up effectively, or Quango, set up by government to give advice to government and paid by government. And they also use this sort of language, though they are more cautious in their language, but they still tend to use this sort of headline figures. Well, what have we done since 1990? We've offshored a lot of our manufacturing. So when we buy in laptops or the microphone I'm using now from China, we admonish China, reprimand China for using steel to smelt the aluminium that I use in this microphone here. Then we blame the Chinese, but I'm using the microphone. So that's one way we do it. We offshore those emissions. We also, when those numbers are used, those headline numbers, we've ignored the emissions from aviation and shipping, international aviation and shipping, which in countries like the UK, indeed many of the sort of wealthier European countries, is a very large part of the emissions. So somewhere very approximately 10 to 12% of our emissions come from aviation and shipping. I work in Sweden quite a lot, and it's even higher there. It's probably somewhere like 17 or 18%. But if you don't include those, that makes you look like you're doing something quite well. So if you took the total carbon footprint of the UK, then that would be about a 15% reduction since 1990. 15%, not 50%. So that's under 0.5% every single year. 0.5%. Now we need somewhere, well, now we've got to the point where probably, even for 2 degrees centigrade, we need probably well over 10% reduction every year. And we've achieved about 0.5%. And actually that's been achieved really through one main approach, and that's been the closure of coal. Now, we haven't closed coal down just because of climate change reasons. We've closed it down because of sulfur reasons, because of a whole set of issues to do with politics and the unions. So there's been a whole sort of history of closing coal down, some of which has been driven by climate change, but much of it has been driven by the EU legislation on sulfur because of the air pollution from coal, and also, of course, by going right the way back from the problems with or disagreements between the unions and the governments of the day. And so we've moved away from coal. That's really good from a climate point of view, though we haven't cared about the communities where those coal mines were. I mean, that I think, and that is still a big issue and one we need to learn from as we phase away from fossil fuels for the oil industry and the workers associated with that. But the shift of coal, there has been now, of course, a rise in renewables, but it's still quite a small percentage. So some people say that half of our electricity comes from renewable sources, or at least low carbon sources. A large part of that is from nuclear. But there's also a lot of wind and some solar in that now. But let's also be clear, of all the energy we consume, what's called our final energy consumption, electricity is only about 18% of that. So about 82% of it is not electricity, and almost all of that is fossil fuels.
Wow.
So what we're then talking about is we've got half of 18% comes from renewables or non-carbon, low carbon sources. So that's about 9%. So over 90% of our energy still comes from non-renewable high carbon sources in the UK. So let's be really careful. When people tell you how wonderful we're doing, what they're often talking about is electricity. Yeah, they're not talking about the other 80 or 90% of the energy we consume. And of course, we have to decarbonize all of our energy, not just electricity. We probably have to electrify much else, transport, heating, much of industry. But at the moment, all we're really focusing on is the current amount of electricity we generate and saying, well, let's make that low carbon. That is just not enough.
Kevin, so this government of ours has very recently given the green light to a new coal mine in Cumbria. When you heard that, what was your initial thoughts? And also, going forward, do you see that coal mine either being opened or shut down as being potentially cause for the environment movement of the UK within the next 2 years? Do you think that is should be the main focus now of getting that coal mine shut down one way or another?
Like all questions, there's often a lot more in that. Opening this coal mine is an utter disgrace, but I'm not too surprised because I have to say this current government quite likes the idea of a sort of a Dickens view of the world, that we've got people freezing in homes, that we've got insecure jobs, and now we add into that, we're going to burn coal, the fuel of the 19th century. So it does fit quite well with how I think this government sees progress in the UK, which is what most of us would call Victorian England. And it seems ridiculous that in 2022, we're going to open a new coal mine. Remember, this coal is almost none of it to use for the UK, very little of it. It's mostly used for steel production. It's a high sulfur coal, so it's a highly polluting coal. We're going to put it on the world market. So what we hope is that other steel producers elsewhere in the world will buy our coal. But of course, it's out there on the world market to compete with other people's coal for steel production. We also know the steel industry is trying, and it needs to try harder, but it is trying and succeeding in some places to move away from coal, which is a key part of the making of steel, is move away from coal. And there are other ways you can carry out that process using hydrogen and other materials. So there's a big emphasis within the steel industry to move away from the use of coal. So what we therefore have is a coal mine in the UK, not to be used very little of it to be used in the UK, to be exported to other parts of the world to feed a steel industry that is desperately trying to move away from coal. And it's a high sulfur coal as well. What it does do, it gives the impression of jobs in an area of the world where the current government wants to have votes. Those jobs are important, but they do not need to be in the coal industry. I mean, what are we going to bring back next? Badger baiting and bear baiting? Are we going to bring back other activities of the 18th and 19th century? Why not? Why are we not employing the people of Cumbria with some of the sort of green technologies that are desperately needed? Retrofitting, putting in renewable energy systems of different sorts. There's plenty of jobs opportunities for those, which are long-term, not reliant upon the vagaries of the world market. But of course, I mean, if the world market does not need so much coal for steel production, then what's going to happen to the mine and the workers in Cumbria? There's no long-term job security here. And I don't think the government were concerned about long-term job security either. It was rhetorical, as is indeed much of their work on climate change. But I think those of us who are concerned about climate change must also be very careful to ensure that we are not completely taken in by this coal issue. I think Michael Gove and some of the other people behind this are using this to disguise the fact that what we're really doing is developing, or hoping to develop, lots more oil and gas. So that we can get the environmental movement to oppose what is, at the end of the day, a relatively small, but still really important coal mine in terms of its emissions. I think it's about 250 billion tons of CO2 over its whole life. So they're looking to almost distract attention away from the fact is this government is looking to license lots more oil and gas production. Now, that is completely at odds with even 2 degrees centigrade of warming. So let's not just be distracted by the coal. What we're talking about here is stopping all fossil fuels, oil, gas, and coal. And you'll certainly hear the oil industry, or the gas industry in this case, talk about gas as a transition fuel. That's nonsense. Unless you want to transition to 4 degrees centigrade of warming, gas is not a transition fuel. If we'd started using it 20, 30 years ago, it might have been. In 2022, gas is very high carbon. We can't afford to be using gas either. So we need to be stopping all fossil fuel production, not just coal. But this going ahead with the coal mine is emblematic of this government's concern for climate change. Well, they're either lying as governments or they're just treating the public as stupid.
Yeah.
But either way, I think it just demonstrates again how the current government, I'm not saying all of the backbench members of the Conservative Party, I'm sure lots of those will be opposed to this as well. But the current government itself is simply not fit for purpose. It's ill-equipped to address these climate change challenges.
Kevin, you mentioned that, to even prevent a 2 degree Celsius rise, we're now talking about 10% reduction in emissions sort of year on year. What kind of policies would you want to see enacted that would be commensurate to the urgency and scale of the crisis?
Well, here I actually think there's a really positive story in this that I hadn't thought about, say, 5, 6, 7 years ago when I worked with some of my other colleagues. We used to think that sort of level of reduction wasn't possible. But I mean, it's massively challenging. But I think over time, I've come to be more aware of the huge discrepancies, not just globally between who emits what, but within our countries. So if you look at somewhere like the UK, we know that our emissions relate quite closely to our income, not completely, but quite closely to our income. The average household income in the UK, what's called the mean income, is £37,000 a year. The median, if you lined up all 26, 28 million households in the UK, and took the one out in the middle, that's about £31,000 a year. And if you said, what's the most typical income for a household in the UK, it's £23,000 a year. Now, all of that group are low emitters, relatively low emitters. Whether if you're on £23,000 a year, even if you've got your heating on in a rubbish rented house because the landlord or landlady hasn't bothered to make it efficient, you're still overall, you won't be traveling very much, you won't be driving very much, you'll be doing almost no flying, you won't be consuming huge amounts. Your carbon footprint will be much lower than the wealthier people in our world, in our country. And so the we in climate change is not us all collectively, not all 68 million of us. There's probably 10, 20 or 30% of us are responsible for the lion's share of emissions in the UK. So the way I see this is there's two parts to this. For most people, responding to climate change is about having the structure of their lives change. That means the quality of their houses, their heating systems, their access to public transport, so retrofitting their properties and all of that. So for them, it's not a fundamental change in the quality, in the lifestyles they have. It's an improvement in the quality of their life because they're able to live in warm, affordable homes with good quality public transport and clean air because less cars around driving past them. So for them, that's good. But it's also, of course, that all of that requires a lot of employment. So it's not short-term jobs. It's not call center jobs. These are highly skilled, apprenticed type employment, fitting in the public transport, building, retrofitting the homes, building passive houses that don't require any heating. So all that physical infrastructure, a little bit like, probably none of us remember post-Second War, very few of us will remember post-Second World War, but what's called the Marshall Plan. So the reconstruction of Europe, where a huge amount of effort was put into rebuilding Europe after we destroyed it all. It's that sort of level of physical activity we require in our societies. And that's very good for the majority in our society from a climate point of view, but also from air quality and from a jobs point of view. But for those of us in the high emitting category, this is really challenging, because the labor and the resources that we currently use excessively is going to be required to actually pay for that public transport, that retrofitting of homes. So we need this huge shift in the labor and the resources from those of us who are relatively wealthy, and primarily that labor and resources service as relative luxuries for us, to be used for these sort of fundamental change of our society. So for this small group, this is going to be very challenging. We won't be able to live in huge homes or have second homes or drive around in massive SUV vehicles, to be frequent flyers, to consume lots and lots of goods. There will be a significant change in our lifestyle. But that will mean for the majority, this will be much better. George Munberry used an expression which I think really captures this. It's about private sufficiency, so living a decent life privately, but public luxury. And so rather than just being people in if we're talking about the Northwest, if it's not, rather than just some people living in Wilmslow and Alderley Edge who live a life of luxury that they can enjoy, they can close their gated community and just live behind that. Actually, what you mean is you may have small parks around the city centre. It means that actually our houses are ones that we can all live in, that there might be good open swimming pools. I mean, you're talking about public luxury that we can all access, rather than just those resources and that luxury is just being held by a few. Now, this helps us address the climate agenda. It also makes us think about what the policy space looked like, and it makes it much more attractive to most voters. If we were seriously interested in levelling up, which I don't think in the slightest we are, but if we were seriously interested in levelling up, this is a really attractive policy message to most people in those communities that we're supposedly trying to level up. Would you like high quality, secure jobs for you and your children? Would you like improvement in air quality? Would you like to be able to afford to pay for heating in your home? Would you like your house not to be so drafty? All of this, of course, people can say, yes, yes, yes. And by the way, it's good for climate change. But then you go out to the places where I do a lot of my cycling, and indeed some of the places near where I live. You come to people like me, I suppose, and others say, do you want to carry on living in a big house? Yes, of course we do. Do you want to carry on with having large cars? Yes. Do you like your frequent flying and business flights? Yes, I like all of that. Well, that is going to have to go. And then you think, well, who sets the agenda? Who is it that sets this agenda? It's the professors, the other senior academics. It's the policymakers, the entrepreneurs, the senior journalists, the senior business leaders. All the people framing the climate agenda are in the top 1% of emitters. And the last thing that we ever want to do is open up that box that says equity is important, because as soon as we do that, we know it has a big impact on us. And so we have pretended we are all in this together, where we're not. The wealthy, for one thing, are less likely to be impacted by climate change in the near term. In the longer term, we will be impacted. But we think we're insulated from climate change, and we think we can just carry on with business as usual because we can pay for it. And we really have not cared about the poorer communities, which is demonstrated in the UK today. 6th richest country, and yet, 7, 8, 9, possibly 10 million households in fuel poverty. We haven't cared about those communities. We haven't cared about the communities we claim to care about in this levelling up agenda. Climate change could be a real trigger for real levelling up.
Now, Kevin, you've been very diplomatic, and you're speaking very sort of academically as well. But I am hearing seeds of some revolutionary talking there, Kev. I must admit. Now, you said previously when you spoke to Greta Thunberg in a recent interview that you are left-leaning in your positions, yeah? Now, what you've said there is that there's a certain percentage of the population, yeah, the welfare, that have to change their lifestyles. Now, I know that you're talking about policy changes and maybe hearing things like universal basic services, which I'm a big fan of. Maybe even things like universal basic income, sort of a combination of both to sort of, in a policy perspective, bring these things into fruition. But if these things don't, if our governments do not seriously implement these policies, Kevin, we are talking about a fight for survival here in regards to everything we love and hold dear. Now, at what point do we say, right, the policy is not going to happen without some sort of disruption, let's call it, from below? Yeah. What should people do? When is the point where you're saying, right, we know what we need to do. We've put forward the policies. They are fair. They are equitable in the sense that you know, we've thought about it. Here are the policies. They are not being enacted. But the issue is still the same. A small percentage of very wealthy people are pretty much destroying the planet. When does that activism kick in? Where we're saying we've now asked for decades politely. We have done the research. We have put forward the policies. We are not being listened to. When does that point take place, Kevin, in regards to when people need to start to get up off their arses and get this sorted?
Well, I think that point is now. I mean, it should have been a long time ago, but we can't turn time back. So we start doing that now. So there are two bits of that. Absolutely, we need bottom-up leadership. And I make this point repeatedly. Do not rely on the great and good and top-down leadership. They are not going to deliver, and I would go as far as to say they are pretty much ill-equipped. They don't have either the ability intellectually or the moral capacity to deliver the changes that are necessary without being forced, either replaced or forced dragging and kicking. And that requires leadership bottom up. And that can be, sort of the sorts of things we're seeing in terms of protests, but it can also be just demonstrating that within our schools, in our places of work, even within our local councils and so forth. So we can be pushing at every single level. And what we do when we push for these changes, and particularly when we talk about and engage them, when we get to see them, that starts a dialogue amongst other people. So I do think what we require is this, and I always often use this language of a messy partnership between bottom-up leadership and top-down leadership. We will not get inspiring ideas from top-down unless they've got them from the bottom. Now that they've understood them, other people have tested them and experimented them. So there is some responsibility on us then to demonstrate leadership. But also, let's be careful this language of the very wealthy. That will include some of the people who are listening to this. I mean, many of us have normalized our lives. If you look at a typical professor in the UK, the average income for a professor in the UK, from what I recently checked, was £85,000 a year. Now that's well over twice the average household income. Now they won't see themselves as the very wealthy, but they are. And indeed, that is true for many in our society who see themselves as sort of like, maybe middle class or upper middle class, but their levels of consumption, their levels of use of resources is still way above the average. So it's not just the sort of the Gates and the Musks, or not just the people living behind the fancy gates in Wilmslow and Alderley Edge. It actually spreads out a little bit wider than that. And so I think we often have to look at ourselves and think, actually, where am I in this grouping? And I think certainly a lot of the people I engage with, not my immediate friends, pretty much all of whom are in the average income sort of level, but all the other, some of my colleagues, a lot of those are in the higher income categories and would still see themselves as normal and part of the solution, rather than the fact they're also part of the problem. So I think just saying that wealthy part we have to unpick, but absolutely, whether you're in that category or whether you're not, I think we need to get all of these people engaged in pushing our government. And there are many ways of doing that. There are lots of protest movements that are out there that would be only too pleased to have more recruits, if you like. But you can do that either if you want to join those sort of institutions, you can join the formal NGOs, the Friends of the Earth and so forth, or you can just engage with your own friends and colleagues at work and be pushing really hard in your work agenda. So I think we all have our different ways that we want to engage in this, but let's be clear, it won't be comfortable. And that's why doing these things together can help. I think when standing out on your own and calling for something is deeply challenging. But when you do it with other people, and you share some sort of vision of a progressive, good quality future for yourself and for your children, then I think it's easier to stand up because there's groups of you. And so I think that sort of collective coming together is really important if we're to push the incompetent, ill-equipped leadership that we currently have on climate change. And let's go the Labour Party. As I said, I'm a member of the Labour Party. The Labour Party certainly is promising to do lots more on climate change, but it is still locked into an old mindset. You hear Rachel Reeves and others just growth, growth, growth. That's what they go on about, without really thinking, growth of what?
Yeah, exactly.
Female literacy, growth in safety on our streets. No, what they mean is economic growth.
Yeah.
Well, I think we have to move away from that old style view of what's good for our economy. Let's look at the things that are good for our society, more than our economy, and let's improve those. And if they happen to improve growth or not, well, so be it. What really matters is making the important parts of our life better. And that's what we should be focusing on. And I think the Labour Party has not really got that. They're certainly not the current leadership of the Labour Party. I think they're better or not as bad as the Conservatives in addressing climate change and the broader set of issues, but I still think they're locked into still an old style mindset.
The interview that Ads mentioned with Greta was on your new media channel, Climate Uncensored, Kevin. Tell us more about that. Give it a plug.
Oh, thanks for that opportunity. Well, Climate Uncensored, climateuncensored.com, is project myself and a colleague, Dan Calverley, set up. Dan and I worked together a long time ago, and then he went off around the world cycling for 5 years, contemplating the world, I suppose. And then he came back, forced back by COVID, and we've been working together ever since. And we set this up because we felt that there's a lot of smoke and mirrors on climate change. And what we wanted to try to do was to sort of pull that apart and reveal what's behind it. Not on everything. There's just two of us working on this at the moment. And so we've used this language of climate uncensored as we're trying to be direct and honest. That might be quite uncomfortable sometimes for people, but that's what we're trying to be within the channel. And we're doing some interviews. We've got some animations on there trying to explain things like what is a carbon budget, what do we mean by equity. We've got some blog posts that are sort of some shorter ones, some more detailed ones on, for instance, like why is 1.5 degrees C important? How hard is it? And what are the policy tools, this is one we're writing at the moment, what are the policy tools that might help us stay within 1.5 to 2 degrees centigrade? So we're trying to be more upfront and honest about this. But I think we're not beholden to any funders. We're not beholden to any organization. And that gives us a freedom to say what we think. And we spend a lot of time thinking about our work and discussing it with other colleagues as well before putting things on the site. But that's why we set it up, was really just to provide people with information. We talked before about bottom-up leadership. Well, unless they can have access to information and material, it's very hard for them to come to judgments. And so we're trying to provide things that help people think about these sets of issues. And that's what, it's just two of us, so we're not going to change the world in a significant way, but we hope to be a catalyst to help a few people think a little differently about these issues. So that's what we're doing, and we hope to keep. We will keep putting on new posts and new videos and so forth.
Brilliant.
Fantastic. Yeah, well, happy to signpost people to that in the show notes. It looks fantastic. Kevin, thank you so much for helping us out here with the climate science. This has been brilliant. I've learnt loads. I'm sure listeners have. And hopefully see you again in 18 months on the show.
It's a pleasure to be with you. Yeah, 18 months. That sounds. 18 months. That's 60 billion tons of carbon dioxide from now.
It might be a whole other conversation. Really be revolution. Yeah. Thanks a lot, Kevin.
We come to that section in the show where we give our kudos. Kevin, who have you got on for this week?
This is going to sound a little strange. I'm going to say Michael Gove.
Interesting. Expand for us.
What?
Well, Michael Gove has given the go-ahead for coalmine, which I think will possibly not be built anyway. But what it will do, and even if it is built, I think it will struggle to find a world market for selling the coal into. But what it has done, I think, is probably catalyzed a lot more opposition to the current apathy about climate change. So it will have helped trigger other people to think, what on earth are we doing in 2022 opening a new coal mine? Yeah. And if Michael Gove can open up, if you like, that prospect of a revolution to move away from business as usual, then that's a really positive step forward.
He's playing the long game, Michael.
Is playing the long. Well, I'd like to think that actually perhaps that was his genuine reason for doing it. I've got a feeling it wasn't, but nevertheless, I would like to thank him for being a catalyst for getting more people recruited into the issue of climate change.
Fabulous.
You had me worried there, Kevin. So no, I'm glad the way it came out there when you said Michael Gove. I was like, what? No, that's good. You might be right. You might be right, mate. Let's hope you are.
My shout this week goes to the philosopher and Cornell University professor Olúfẹ Táíwò. Described as one of America's most prominent philosophers, Olúfẹ explores the intersections of climate justice and colonialism, asking how we achieve social justice, and in particular racial justice, in a world hammered with environmental breakdown and rampant inequality. For example, how can the world achieve justice when there's mass displacement or huge instability in energy systems? Under what conditions could a programme of reparations for those disadvantaged by the legacy of colonialism help? What do we mean by the term justice? And what should we be willing to compromise on politically to improve people's lives? We'd love to explore these knotty but fascinating questions with Olúfẹ on the show.
Okay, so a lot of people did great work in 2022, but my shout out is going to be for those that are already planning to put even more effort in 2023. As environmental activists, we know that every year the task just seems to get harder and harder. So we need more people doing bigger and better things. So my shout out to anybody that's strategizing and planning for 2023 to go again, and let's do this.
We'd like to say thank you to all our ACE supporters on Patreon, with a special shout out to Angela Brown, Barbara Burke, Jill Burke, Guillermund and Kaylee Woods Harley. If you'd like to join these amazing people and support our show, head to patreon.com/gndmediauk.